The making of a shadow the name Clarence Hill would one day become shorthand for fear. By the 1970s, parents would whisper it like a curse, and newspapers would print it in bold ink heavy enough to bleed through their pages. But long before his smile became the sort of smile people swore could hollow out a room, Clarence was simply a boy born into an ordinary Detroit home, a boy who should have grown into a man like any other. The Hills were quiet, respectable people. His father worked shifts at a factory that kept him gray with fatigue, while his mother tended to a household stitched together with frugal devotion. Their son, though, never quite fit the picture they wanted to frame. Even as a toddler, Clarence seemed absent. When his mother bent down to coo at him, he did not giggle or reach back for her hand. His eyes would fix instead on the slow crawl of shadows across the ceiling or the trembling pulse in her wrist. The neighbors remembered him as a polite child, though too still, too careful. He never shouted during games, never scraped his knees running with the others. Instead, Clarence watched. He watched with a focus that unsettled, as though he were studying not how to join the world, but how to dissect it. Cats went missing on their street. Birds were found with their wings torn clean. The neighborhood children whispered his name when they found the remains. They were afraid, yet drawn in by the mystery of his silence, the way he could stand just behind you without a sound until you felt his presence like a cold hand on your back. By adolescence, whatever distance had once separated Clarence from his peers widened into a chasm. His classmates spoke of his cruelty not in shouts but in hushed tones, the way one speaks about a storm forming on the horizon. He did not strike or shove, he suggested. Push him. He once told another boy, gesturing toward a smaller child at the edge of a frozen pond. The boy hesitated, laughed nervously, but Clarence just smiled. Hours later, the smaller child went home soaked and shivering, and Clarence's hands remained dry. It was his way, never directly guilty, always the architect behind the curtain. Teachers described him as intelligent, though difficult to read. He turned in essays that were meticulously argued, sharp in their language, but cold in tone-clinical dissections of topics that should have inspired at least a spark of youthful passion. When asked to write about his dreams for the future, Clarence submitted 3 pages on the futility of ambition and the inevitability of decay. The teacher returned it with a C, scribbling "too morbid" in red ink. Clarence did not argue. He simply stared at the note until the teacher looked away, unsettled by his unblinking calm. At home, tension thickened. His mother tried prayers, his father tried sternness, but neither could reach him. Meals were eaten in silence, the scrape of a fork the only sound. Sometimes his mother would catch her son staring at her hands, at the knife she used to cut bread, as though studying the ritual of it. She told herself it was nothing. Mothers tell themselves many things to keep love intact. By the time Clarence entered university, he had perfected his mask. To fellow students, he seemed reserved but charming in small doses. He knew how to flash a smile just wide enough, how to tilt his head at the right moment, how to say little but leave others feeling heard. It was enough to earn invitations to dorm gatherings, enough to make professors call him promising. Beneath that mask, however, something simmered, a hunger he had carried since childhood, sharpened by years of silence. It revealed itself one winter night in the most ordinary of places, a student party. The air was thick with beer, smoke, and the hum of music straining cheap speakers. Clarence stood apart at first, as he always did, sipping from a cup he barely touched. But someone shoved him playfully, someone else laughed, and in that simple act of careless human connection, something in Clarence broke open. Witnesses would later describe the scene in fragments, the sudden violence, the shattered glass, the way Clarence moved with terrifying precision, as if rehearsed. One boy's face was slashed, another's arm twisted until bone snapped. The music stopped, screams filled the air, and in the center of it all, Clarence smiled. Not wide, not manic, but calm, a smile that seemed to say he had been waiting. The arrest came quickly. Police hauled him from his dormitory, but even in handcuffs he did not fight. He walked between the officers with the composure of a man attending his own coronation. The trial that followed was a spectacle. The courtroom swelled with families of the injured. classmates who testified in trembling voices, professors who struggled to reconcile the boy they thought they knew with the violence they had seen. The prosecution painted him as a predator hiding in plain sight. The defense argued temporary madness, a break under the strain of youth and expectation, but the most chilling moments came when Clarence himself was addressed. Reporters wrote of the way he looked at the jury, his eyes calm, his mouth curling into a polite smile as though the proceedings were nothing more than theater. The judge, faced with a crime too brutal to ignore yet too ambiguous to sentence with simple clarity, chose a compromise. Rather than a prison term, Clarence was to be committed to St. Jude's psychiatric facility. There, the court declared, he would receive treatment. The word hung heavy in the air, treatment. As though something so cold, so deliberate, could be softened by therapy, by drugs, by the rituals of white coats and clipboards. When the verdict was read, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Some wept with relief, believing madness could be cured. Others shuddered, sensing that prison bars might have been safer than padded walls. Clarence, for his part, did not flinch. He only nodded once, a subtle dip of the head, as if this had been his design all along. On the day he was transported to St. Jude's, the sky was gray, heavy with snow. He sat in the back of the van, wrists bound, eyes fixed on the blurred cityscape beyond the window, factories, schools, homes, all passing in silence. Somewhere in that steel, gray reflection, Clarence Hill ceased to be just a young man. He became the beginning of something else, a patient, a subject, a predator delivered to a place that thought itself a cage. What the city did not yet know, what his parents could not admit, what the court could not fathom, was that Clarence Hill did not fear confinement. He welcomed it. For him, St. Jude's would not be a prison. It would be a stage, and every stage requires an audience. The door of the van slammed shut, the locks clicked, snow fell like ash over Detroit, and Clarence Hill disappeared into St. Jude's, smiling. The theater of St. Jude, the iron gates of St. Jude's psychiatric facility, closed behind Clarence Hill with a metallic groan that seemed, to those who heard it, like the tolling of a bell. For most, arrival at St. Jude's marked the beginning of silence, sedation, and obscurity. Patients entered the walls, and the city quickly forgot their names. But Clarence was not most patients. The moment his boots touched the polished tile of the admitting ward, something shifted in the air, as though the asylum itself had inhaled sharply, bracing for what had come inside. St. Jude stood on the northern edge of Detroit, a looming brick complex built in the late 19th century when medicine was still half superstition, half experiment. Its long wings stretched like arms clutching the ground, its windows sealed with iron grates that threw skeletal shadows across the snow. The walls smelled faintly of carbolic acid, iodine, and despair. Nurses moved in white uniforms, their shoes clicking in steady rhythm, while orderlies pushed rattling carts stacked with trays, syringes, and bottles labeled with faded Latin. Into this world stepped Clarence Hill, committed not for healing but for containment. At least that was the intent. What unfolded instead would expose the frailty of institutions and the vanity of men who thought they could measure evil with calipers and notes. The early week's ward logs describe him in neutral phrases at first. Subject, male, 21, height, 6'1", alert, composed, affect, flat, cooperative with intake. No resistance. The handwriting is steady, the ink clean, the confidence of staff unshaken. But within weeks, entries began to shift. Subject polite, attentive. Requests extra reading material. Subject unusually skilled at eliciting personal disclosures from staff. Nurses report feelings of unease despite patients' outward calm. It was not what Clarence did, but what he provoked. He had a way of asking questions that seemed harmless on the surface. Did your father live long? Do you ever hear the pipes at night? Do you ever wonder what keeps you here? The questions lingered, carving doubts where none had existed before. Patients began to gather near him during meal hours. He spoke little, yet his silence invited confession. Men and women whispered their secrets, their fears, their half-mad visions into his ear. He listened, never judging. always smiling just enough to keep them speaking. He became less a fellow inmate and more a confessor, a dark priest in the Church of the Broken. The doctor's doctor, Alan Mercer, senior psychiatrist, considered Clarence a model subject. In his notes, dated March 1971, he wrote, "Hill demonstrated intelligence above average, no overt signs of psychosis. A certain cold detachment, yes, but I suspect much of it is defensive. He engages with authority respectfully, prognosis, cautiously optimistic. Treatment plan, occupational therapy, minor sedatives." The arrogance of that optimism would later be cited in hearings when lawmakers demanded to know how Clarence had been allowed to flourish within the asylum. But even Mercer, careful as he was, noted peculiarities. Clarence never raised his voice, never resisted injections or restraints, but there was a sharpness in his compliance, as though he granted permission rather than submitted. During examinations, he fixed his gaze on the instruments, forceps, calipers, stethoscopes, his eyes tracking them not as a patient would, but as a surgeon might. When ether was administered to a fellow patient before shock therapy, Clarence leaned forward, inhaling deeply as though savoring the scent. A nurse wrote in her marginal notes, his expression was not fear. It was hunger. The whispers the asylum had always been noise. He screams in the night, muttered prayers, fists pounding on locked doors. But in the months after Clarence's arrival, a new sound began to thread through the corridors, whispers. Patients spoke of the man who smiled. They claimed he could quiet their nightmares with a single word, that he could enter their dreams. Some said he promised escape, others that he warned of fire or blood or the end of days. One orderly recalled entering the day room late at night and finding a half-circle of patients gathered around Clarence. He was not speaking aloud, but each person leaned in as if listening. When the orderly demanded dispersal, Clarence only looked up and said, "They're learning to listen properly now." The staff dismissed these accounts as hysteria, but then came the first incident. The instruments on June 14, 1971. A nurse discovered her set of obstetric forceps missing from the locked cabinet in Ward C. Days later, a patient was found in his cell, bleeding from shallow cuts etched across his chest in deliberate patterns. The shapes resembled diagrams found in Mercer's medical journals, muscle groups dissected with anatomical precision. The patient claimed Clarence had spoken to him through the wall, guiding his hand. No forceps were ever recovered. Other tools vanished in the months that followed, scalpels, clamps, even an ether mask. Each theft coincided with strange events. Patients found in trances. Journals defaced with phrases in slashing script. Hospitals are hives. "I will never stop." Dr. Mercer insisted these were coincidences. His reports grew defensive, his language more clipped. Yet the nurses began locking their quarters at night, some refusing to walk alone through the halls. The asylum had always been haunted by its own suffering, but with Clarence inside, the haunting seemed to sharpen into deliberate cruelty. The winter of silence by late 1971, Detroit was already uneasy. Rumors of unrest, crime, and shadowed streets bled into the asylum's walls. Clarence seemed to absorb it all, his calm intensifying as the city grew restless. That winter, the first death occurred inside St. Jude's. A young nurse, scarcely 23, was found in the laundry, strangled with her own belt. The official report listed another patient as the culprit, but among staff the truth spread quickly. Clarence had been seen near the laundry hours before. He denied involvement, of course. He always denied, with his smile that suggested denial itself was a kind of mockery. The nurse's death marked a turning point. Patients grew restless, staff avoided certain corridors, and the sound of whispers multiplied. It was as though the building itself had inhaled Clarence's presence and could not expel it. A note in the archives buried in the archives of St. Jude's, pages now stamped confidential property of Detroit Metropolitan Court. There survives a single scrap of paper, written in an unfamiliar but steady hand. "I will remake the ward in my image. Every man a reflection, every woman a vessel. They call this treatment. I call it preparation." No one knows whether the note was Clarence's or a fabrication, but it was discovered tucked into Dr. Mercer's personal journal. the pages smudged with what archivists later confirmed was dried blood. Clarence Hill had entered St. Jude's as a patient, but by the end of that first year it was no longer clear who was studying whom. Doctors wrote their observations, but it was Clarence who observed them. Nurses carried trays of medicine, but it was Clarence who administered fear. The asylum believed it was containing a young man. In truth, it was nurturing something far darker. The city outside would learn soon enough, for within those red brick walls, a theater had been prepared, and Clarence Hill was rehearsing. Escalation in the hive. St. Jude's had housed violent men before. Its wards bore scars of broken windows. Its floors remembered the weight of restraints dragged across tile. But none of those men resembled Clarence Hill. Violence had always been something the institution knew how to contain, with straps, with sedatives, with locked doors. Clarence did not rage, did not shout, did not thrash. He smiled, and men obeyed. The first rumblings by spring of 1972, the ward logs thickened with incidents too minor to provoke headlines, yet too unsettling to dismiss. March 3, Patient 47 refuses meals unless served by Hill. Patient 47 states Hill tells him what food is safe. March 12, 2 patients found exchanging blood via self-inflicted cuts. Both insist Clarence said it was the only way to be brothers. March 28, Patient 62 found writing symbols in feces on cell wall. When asked why, he repeated, "Hill smiles, so I must." The staff began calling it the contagion, not madness, not delusion, but something else. An infection of thought passed from lips to ears, from eyes to eyes. Clarence was not forcing them. He was planting, and the asylum soil was fertile. Dr. Mercer's decline. Dr. Mercer, once confident in his promising subject, grew frayed. His notes shifted from clinical observation to something closer to obsession. Hill refuses to reveal inner life. He acknowledges no fear. His language, increasingly metaphorical, refers to ward as hive. Claims doctors are drones who serve without realizing, difficult to counter without becoming entangled in his logic. Mercer began visiting him daily, sometimes twice. Other doctors whispered that he was being drawn into Clarence's gravity, that his career would collapse if he continued. Yet Mercer persisted, scribbling arguments, counter-arguments, defenses against Clarence's words. The danger was not merely what Clarence said, but how he said it. A question from him could unspool hours of reasoning until Mercer himself doubted whether he was doctor or patient. Nurses later testified that Mercer often left Clarence's sessions pale, sweating, muttering fragments of phrases like he sees too clearly, and language itself is his tool. By summer, Mercer had begun drinking before his shifts. In September, he stopped showing up altogether. His resignation letter was never found. The rituals without Mercer to shield him, Clarence expanded. He began arranging his fellow patients into crude imitations of religious ceremonies. In the day room, he would seat them in rows, directing them to hum low, broken tones while he stood before them, hands folded. Visitors reported it looked like a chapel, though no scripture was spoken. Only fragments of medical jargon twisted into litany, incision, suture, extraction, vessel, hive. A nurse who interrupted one of these gatherings described the sight in her incident report. "They looked at me as though I were intruding on prayer. Even those who normally screamed or rocked in corners sat calm, attentive. Hill raised his hand and they went silent in perfect unison. He did not order them, they wanted to obey. The rituals escalated. Patients scratched symbols into their arms with stolen scalpels, hexagons, circles, crude depictions of forceps and bone saws. Clarence never touched the instruments himself. He instructed, he guided, he smiled. The first fire in October 1972, a fire broke out in the storage wing. Orderlies fought the blaze with buckets while fire brigades were summoned. When the smoke cleared, investigators found no accidental cause. Someone had doused bedding in ether stolen from the surgical supplies. Whispers pointed to Clarence. Patients claimed he had spoken of purification by flame. One said he dreamed Clarence walking through smoke untouched, smiling. But no evidence was ever found, no matches in his cell, no burns on his skin. Officially, the fire was listed as unresolved. Unofficially, it was the beginning of fear among staff, for if Clarence could not be linked, if he could not be pinned, then he was no longer just a patient. He was a phantom, slipping between walls. The lullabies in winter, another horror seeped through St. Jude's. Nurses reported hearing lullabies at night, drifting through corridors, not sung by Clarence, but by others, hardened men, broken women, murmuring children's hymns in cracked voices. One nurse, terrified, traced the sound to Clarence's ward. Through the slit of a door, she saw him sitting cross-legged on the floor, while 3 other patients rocked in rhythm, humming the very lullaby mothers once used to put infants to sleep. The nurse resigned the following week. The hospital on trial beyond the asylum walls, the city grew restless. Families of patients began filing suits against St. Jude's, claiming negligence, secrecy, inhumane treatment. Journalists sniffed around, catching rumors of rituals and strange gatherings. The name Clarence Hill surfaced in whispers, though administrators worked desperately to suppress it. At one hearing in early 1973, a former nurse testified under oath. He doesn't just hurt them, he rearranges them, he makes them his instruments. We thought we were studying him, but he was studying us. Her words were struck from the official record, redacted with heavy black lines. Yet the rumor spread anyway. The first disappearance in February 1973, a patient went missing, not escaped, missing. His bed was made, his clothes folded, no window broken, no door forced. Guards swore no one had left the grounds. His name was Jacob Whitlow, age 29, committed for paranoia. The last person seen speaking to him was Clarence Hill. When staff questioned Clarence, he only smiled and said the hive needed him elsewhere. Jacob Whitlow's body was never found. The smell in the pipes that spring, a foul odor began seeping from the pipes. Maintenance crews tore apart walls, convinced an animal had died in the crawl spaces. What they found instead was a collection of blood, soaked rags stuffed deep into vents, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. On one rag in dried brown script was written, "Hospitals are hives. I will never stop." The handwriting matched that found earlier in Dr. Mercer's journal. Clarence, everywhere by mid-1973, Clarence's influence was no longer confined. Nurses reported seeing his smile reflected in windows when he was locked elsewhere. Patients whispered his words in voices not their own. Orderlies found crude dolls made of straw and bandages tucked beneath pillows, their faces marked with his initials. Even doctors began to falter. One psychiatrist attempted to resign, claiming Clarence had appeared in her dreams. She was found days later wandering the grounds barefoot, muttering, "He's already outside, he's already outside." The asylum was cracking, not from riots, not from brute force, but from the slow seep of Clarence Hill's presence. He was patient, like rot, like mold, like rust. The hive was learning his song. By the end of 1973, one truth was undeniable. Clarence was not being treated. He was becoming. And though the gates still stood, though his name remained confined to whisper and file, Detroit itself would soon feel the consequences, for a hive cannot hold once the queen takes flight. The awakening, the year was 1974 when St. Jude's finally ruptured. Those who were there describe it not as an outbreak of violence, but as an unsealing, something that had been building for years, fermenting in silence, finally released in a single catastrophic surge. Clarence Hill did not escape in chaos. He conducted it. The days before, for weeks, the asylum carried an unnatural calm. Patients who once screamed and clawed at walls grew quiet. The usual chorus of coughing, sobbing, muttering diminished. The orderlies remarked uneasily that it was too calm. Ward logs in the final days, March 7, all patients in Ward C refused breakfast trays, sat in silence for entire meal period, Hill observed smiling. March 9, night nurse reports humming in corridors again, lullabies unidentifiable source. March 11, Hill overheard telling patient 21, "It won't be long now, the hive will open." No alarms were raised. To outsiders, these were minor disturbances, but to those within, it was the stillness before a storm. The night of March 12, 1974, the massacre began in the early hours, when most of the ward was asleep. Guards later swore they heard no doors forced, no alarms tripped, only a sound, a low, pulsing hum, as though dozens of voices were chanting in unison. By the time orderlies arrived, Clarence had already moved through 2 wards. He carried no weapon, at least none the reports agreed upon. Some claimed a sharpened bone handled like a blade. Others swore he wielded a stolen scalpel. Still others insisted he needed nothing at all, that his hands were enough. What is certain is this: 2 lives ended before dawn. Patients were found with throats cut, bodies arranged in grotesque tableau. 2 orderlies were discovered bound with their own belts, their faces carved into wide, smiling masks. A nurse was found in the chapel, slumped against the altar, her chest opened as though by surgical incision. On the walls of 3 wards, scrawled in blood, were the words, "I am awake now," the vanishing when police and fire brigades stormed St. Jude's. At first light, Clarence Hill was gone. Every door remained locked, every window barred. No alarms had been triggered. They searched the grounds for 3 days. Divers scoured the river nearby. Dogs were brought in, following a scent that seemed to vanish at the outer wall. One report, buried in the archives, claimed the hounds circled endlessly, whining, unable to track him further. Theories abounded: bribed guards, secret tunnels, clerical errors. Yet none explained how a man so distinctive could slip not only from the asylum, but from the city itself, without a single confirmed sighting. Clarence Hill had become what he had always promised: outside. Detroit, in panic, news of the massacre shattered Detroit. Headlines screamed of the smiling killer. Papers described a phantom butcher loose in the city. Families locked doors, schools posted guards, shops closed early. For weeks, every violent crime was attributed to him: a stabbing in Greektown, a missing woman on the east side, a child's body pulled from the river. Police denied most connections, but the public refused to believe them. Clarence's name became shorthand for evil itself. Talk shows buzzed. Rumors spread that he wrote letters to newspapers, taunting them. One editor at the Detroit Free Press swore he received an envelope containing only a single sentence, written in crimson ink: "You smile too when you sleep." The envelope vanished from the archives soon after. The homecoming months later, whispers emerged from Clarence's childhood neighborhood. A neighbor reported screams from the Hill house, long abandoned. Another claimed to see lights flickering in the windows at midnight. Police dismissed the claims as hysteria until they searched. Inside the house, they found Clarence's father dead, his body butchered beyond recognition, posed in his study chair with a smile carved across his face. His mother, somehow alive, sat shackled to her bed, her wrists bound with surgical gauze, eyes wide with silent terror. When questioned, she could barely speak. What words she gave were fragmented: "He's here, always here," smiling. She was committed to a private sanatorium under heavy guard. Clarence himself was nowhere to be found. Letters and legends through the late 1970s. The killings continued, not in St. Jude's, not confined to Detroit, but scattered across Michigan and beyond. Always brutal, always theatrical, yet it was the letters that elevated Clarence into folklore. Mailed to news desks, tucked into library books, sometimes left at crime scenes, they dripped with a tone of mockery and inevitability. "You study me still, but you have it backwards. I study you. A hive does not end when you burn it. The queen is already flying. Smile and you are mine." Handwriting experts disagreed whether they were authentic. Police refused to confirm, but by then it scarcely mattered. Clarence had become less man than story. The FBI files by 1979, federal investigators had been drawn in. Unredacted fragments of their files released decades later under FOIA reveal the panic Clarence inspired. Subject is to be considered highly organized, killings ritualized, displays consistent with psychogenic delusion of control. Belief in hive structure appears central. Unclear if killing solely his work, copycats likely. But even within the FBI, consensus broke down. Some agents claimed he was dead, that the letters were fabrications. Others argued he was more than alive, that he was expanding, a contagion of violence spreading through language, imitation, myth. Into legend by the early 1980s, Clarence Hill had vanished from official record. No trial, no capture, no confirmed death, only stories, each more grotesque than the last. Teenagers dared one another to say his name in mirrors. Patients in mental wards whispered of the smiling man. Entire neighborhoods claimed sightings most unprovable, some too detailed to dismiss. Detroit never fully recovered from his shadow. Bars still bolted doors early. Families refused to discuss the spring of 1974. St. Jude's, gutted by lawsuits and fear, closed its doors within 5 years, its windows bricked over like the eyes of a corpse, and still letters surfaced. One as late as 1992 found in a library copy of The Hive and the Honey. B. signed with his familiar scrawl, "The hive never dies, it only waits." The unending smile Clarence Hill had crossed into the realm of American folklore, the bogeyman who was once flesh and blood, now untethered, his crimes woven into cautionary tales, urban legends, and whispered fears. Whether he lived or died ceased to matter. What mattered was that his story smiled back from the dark, refusing burial. To this day, in the sealed archives of Detroit, police still keep a box marked simply, Hill, C. Its contents, photographs, bloody rags, redacted letters, are locked from public view, and on the last page of the last file, written in handwriting no one admits to penning, are the words, "I am still awake." The man who would not die by 1975, Detroit no longer belonged to itself. The streets looked the same, the factories still belched smoke, but the air carried something different, an unease that seeped into every conversation, every locked door, every night spent staring at windows after dark. Clarence Hill had vanished, but his shadow stretched longer than ever. A city held hostage the massacre at St. Jude's was supposed to be the end of him. Police reports said he could not have escaped. Federal investigators insisted he must have died in the snow, but the public refused such easy closure. Too many claimed to see him. Some said Clarence was spotted on Jefferson Avenue, walking calmly in broad daylight, smiling at children. Others swore he was seen boarding a bus westward, his eyes fixed on the horizon. A waitress in Chicago reported a quiet customer who left behind a napkin with the words, "I am awake," written in neat, deliberate letters. The city began to treat him not as a man, but as a haunting. Parents warned children not to stay out late, whispering, "The smiling man will find you." Churches filled with parishioners seeking protection against a killer who had somehow slipped into myth. The Detroit Police Department was overwhelmed. Tips arrived hourly. Every blurred face in a crowd, every tall stranger walking too quickly, every pair of still unblinking eyes. Clarence was everywhere. Which meant he was nowhere. The letters then came the letters, neat handwriting, careful grammar, no errors, always signed C, H, or sometimes just C. They arrived at newspapers, schools, police stations, even private homes. Some were taunts, others were sermons. A few read like riddles meant to be unraveled in the dead of night. "You fear me because you think I am alone. I am not. The hive breathes through all of you. Children are the purest mirrors. They do not pretend not to see me. When you pray at night, remember, I am awake while you sleep." Editors debated endlessly, were they authentic? Criminologists dissected the phrasing, the loops of the letters, the cold precision of his words. The FBI warned papers not to publish them, fearing mass hysteria, but the temptation was too strong. Every time a letter appeared in print, sales doubled, and every time fear deepened. The smiling killer, the press created his identity as much as Clarence did himself. The name Smiling Killer appeared on front pages beside his mugshot, an old arrest photo where his lips curled faintly upward, his eyes unsettlingly calm. Psychologists called him narcissistic, sociopathic, delusional, but their words did not stick the way Smiling Killer did. The public latched onto the nickname because it fit the dread. It was simple, it was unforgettable. It was a warning passed between parents and children. Don't trust the smiling man. The myth outgrew the truth. Copycat killers claimed allegiance to Clarence. Teenagers scribbled "I am awake" on school walls. Radical groups invoked his name in rallies, painting him as proof that American institutions were rotten to their core. What had begun as bloodshed in a psychiatric ward was becoming folklore. The FBI struggled. By 1976, the FBI had taken over the case, labeling Clarence armed and extremely dangerous. Wanted posters circulated nationwide. His photograph, handsome, symmetrical, unsettlingly clean cut, was plastered across gas stations, bus depots, post offices. Agents followed thousands of leads, a sighting in Milwaukee, another in Baton Rouge, a third in Montreal. Each turned up nothing. They intercepted letters, tracked fingerprints, even staged stings with decoys. Clarence remained a step ahead. Internal memos leaked years later revealed the desperation. Subject may have assistance from sympathizers, possible underground network of radicals, alternatively widespread misidentification phenomenon. Unclear if same individual responsible for all crimes attributed to Clarence Hill. Likelihood of mythologization at 80%. Even the FBI began to doubt themselves. Was Clarence a single man still roaming free? Or had he become a contagion, an idea infecting others who killed in his name? The home that would not stay empty that winter, police returned once more to the Hill family home. It had been boarded up since the discovery of Clarence's father murdered and his mother confined in madness. Yet neighbors reported noises, windows slamming, lights glowing faintly at night, a shadow moving past the curtains. When officers broke inside, they found the house silent, coated in dust. But in the upstairs hallway, scrawled across the plaster in what appeared to be dried blood, were 3 words, still awake now. Forensics could not determine when it had been written. The blood type was unknown. The handwriting was unmistakable. The spread between 1977 and 1980, murders bearing Clarence's mark were reported across the Midwest. Some were small. A janitor found with his throat slit. A homeless man drowned in a fountain. An abandoned farmhouse painted with the phrase, "I am awake." Others were large-scale atrocities, the stabbing of an entire family in Illinois, the disappearance of 3 nurses in Ohio, a bus driver strangled with his own seatbelt while passengers slept. Police often denied Clarence's involvement. Isolated cases, they said, coincidence. But the public refused to believe. For them, Clarence had transcended human limitations. He could be anywhere, kill anyone, vanish at will. He was a phantom dressed in flesh. Scholars and students, perhaps strangest of all, was how intellectual circles seized upon him. College students wrote essays analyzing his letters as if they were literature. Professors debated his references to hives and queens, interpreting them as metaphors for society, government, or madness itself. Some radicals claimed he was a revolutionary, exposing the hypocrisy of institutions. Others whispered that he was a prophet. One underground journal even published his letters alongside manifestos about tearing down psychiatric care. The families of victims were horrified but powerless. Clarence Hill had become too fascinating to ignore. The ghost in every room by the early 1980s. Clarence was less a criminal case and more a cultural wound. Movies referenced him. Folk songs whispered his name. Children told campfire stories of the smiling man who waited in the dark until you smiled back. And yet, the killings did not stop. One Detroit detective who worked the case for a decade said it best. Clarence isn't a man anymore, he's an infection. Every murder we see, people ask if it's him, and sometimes I think maybe it is. But maybe it's not one person at all. Maybe it's the smile that keeps spreading. The last known letter in 1982, a letter arrived at the Chicago Tribune. It was short, no more than a sentence, but it chilled even hardened investigators. The hive is not broken. The hive is growing. The handwriting matched perfectly. The envelope bore no prints. Postmark, Detroit. After that, nothing. No confirmed letters. No reliable sightings. Clarence Hill disappeared into the folds of American folklore. A man who had killed 22 in a single night and somehow lived forever in the whispers of those who feared him. An open ending even now, decades later, there are claims. An old man smiling too wide on a Greyhound bus. A figure watching from the edge of a playground. Graffiti repeating the same jagged phrase in cities far from Detroit. I am awake now. The FBI file on Clarence Hill has never officially closed. His box of evidence sits locked in an archive marked with the words, "Active Unresolved." And somewhere, if the whispers are true, a man still walks with calm eyes and a slight smile. A man who erased the line between myth and flesh, a man who never stopped being awake, the smile that would not fade. By 1983, Clarence Hill was no longer simply a fugitive. He was a cultural phantom. Detroit had given birth to him, but his shadow now touched cities far beyond. If the police hoped the passing years would erode his legend, they were mistaken. Time did not weaken his name, it sharpened it. The quiet years, for nearly 3 years after the Tribune letter, nothing new appeared. Newspapers speculated Clarence was dead, perhaps rotting in some nameless ditch, his smile erased at last. Politicians urged the public to move on, but silence itself became suspicious. People whispered that Clarence had not vanished but gone underground, learning patience. "The smile waits," one talk radio host declared, "and waiting is the most terrifying weapon of all." The absence of violence felt less like peace and more like a breath drawn before another strike. The return in the winter of 1985, the killings began again. A nurse in Kalamazoo was found strangled in her apartment, her lips cut into a grotesque grin. On the wall, scrawled in a mixture of blood and ink, were the words, "You forgot me." 2 months later, a Greyhound bus stopped in Indiana when passengers complained of a smell. In the restroom, a man was discovered with his throat slit, his pockets stuffed with paper scraps bearing a single phrase repeated in careful script, "Still awake." The FBI refused to confirm Clarence's involvement. But the handwriting analysis was conclusive. It was him. Detroit erupted again with fear. Clarence Hill, gone for years, had returned. A nation on edge by the late 1980s, Clarence had become a household name across America. News anchors spoke his name with the same reverence they used for warlords or dictators. His myth had crossed into television dramas, cheap horror novels, even rock lyrics. Children dared one another at sleepovers to whisper his name in mirrors. Teenagers painted "I am awake" on abandoned buildings, half as rebellion, half as superstition. Police found themselves overwhelmed by false sightings. A tall man smiling too much on a subway. A stranger staring too long at a bus stop. Clarence was everywhere. The panic grew so widespread that the FBI coined an internal term for it, Hill syndrome. The copycats, what made the era especially dangerous, was the wave of imitators. Between 1986 and 1992, dozens of murders were committed by men claiming inspiration from Clarence. Some carved his name into victims' skin, others left behind letters mimicking his style. Few of them were convincing. Their handwriting lacked his precision. Their killings lacked his unsettling restraint. Yet, even failed imitations had consequences. They blurred the line between Clarence himself and the legend he had birthed. Investigators admitted privately that the case files were a labyrinth. Where did Clarence end and his echoes begin? The cult whisper in 1989, rumors spread of something darker, a group calling itself the Awakened. Scattered across Michigan and Ohio, they gathered in basements, barns, and abandoned buildings. Their rituals included reading Clarence's letters aloud as scripture. They wore masks carved with fixed smiles. Some reports even claimed they practiced reenactments of his murders, staging elaborate plays of domination and silence. When police raided one such gathering in Toledo, they found crude drawings of Clarence's face, copied from his mugshot, surrounded by the words, "Hives never die." No evidence proved Clarence himself led these groups. Perhaps he never even knew of them, but the cults demonstrated a terrible truth. Clarence had transcended the need to kill in person. His myth was doing the work for him. The scholars debate by the 1990s. Clarence Hill was no longer just a criminal in police records. He was studied in classrooms. Universities taught courses on the Hill phenomenon. Students debated whether he was a product of failed psychiatric institutions or a living embodiment of cultural decay. Journals published essays analyzing the philosophy in his letters. Was his obsession with hives a metaphor for hospitals, for society itself, for God? One infamous article, published in the American Journal of Forensic Psychiatry in 1991, concluded, Clarence Hill exists in the public consciousness as both killer and prophet. Whether alive or dead, he has become a symbol of institutional collapse, familial failure, and the weaponization of charisma. He is no longer a man, but a mirror. The article was later retracted under public pressure, but the idea had already taken hold. The vanishing again after 1993, Clarence's trail went cold once more. Murders still happened, grisly, deliberate, staged, but none bore irrefutable traces. Letters stopped, sightings dwindled, the awakened cult fractured into splinter groups, each more pathetic and desperate than the last. And yet, his presence did not fade. In 1996, a police officer in Lansing swore he saw Clarence sitting calmly in the back of a diner, eating pie, smiling faintly at every patron. By the time backup arrived, the booth was empty. In 1998, a child in Detroit claimed a man had spoken to her in a park. He bent low and whispered, "Do you know who I am?" She ran home crying, insisting the stranger had smiled too wide. None of these sightings were confirmed, but no one dismissed them either. Clarence Hill was now too embedded in the culture to be denied. The archive closes at the turn of the millennium. The FBI quietly reclassified the Clarence Hill file. His case was no longer active pursuit. It was relabeled as archival threat. In practice, this meant agents were told not to spend further resources chasing ghosts, but the file remained sealed, accessible only to select officials. Its final memo was stark. Subject may still be alive, or subject may be legend only. Both possibilities equally dangerous. A smile without end by 2000, Clarence Hill had ceased to be a man who killed. He had become the concept of killing itself, a face every city feared, a smile painted on every stranger too kind, every neighbor too quiet. Families who had lost loved ones still spoke his name with venom. Scholars still debated his letters. Teenagers still dared one another to summon him in mirrors, and police still jumped whenever a body was left with a carved grin. Because whether Clarence Hill still walked the earth or not, one fact was undeniable: he had never truly left. The digital smile, the dawn of the 21st century, should have erased Clarence Hill. Cameras were everywhere now. Bank lobbies, grocery stores, street corners. DNA databases grew fat with blood samples, hair follicles, cigarette butts. What could a fugitive born in the 1940s hope to achieve against such a net? And yet, in the first decade of the new millennium, Clarence did not wither. He metastasized. The Forum years in 2001, an obscure message board hosted on a forgotten corner of the internet, began to attract attention. Its banner image was simple, a crudely drawn smile, jagged and uneven. The board was titled "The Hive is Awake." At first, it appeared to be a curiosity. Users traded newspaper clippings about unsolved murders, transcripts of Clarence's old letters, and wild speculation about his whereabouts. Some claimed to be former inmates of St. Jude's. Others hinted they had seen him in motel lobbies, on Greyhound buses, at hospital waiting rooms. But the deeper one scrolled, the darker it grew. Users began posting diagrams, sketches of forceps, ether masks, bone saws. Hand-drawn floor plans of asylums. Then came images of mutilated dolls, their mouths carved into impossible grins. Moderators insisted it was all performance art. Urban horror roleplay, they called it. But law enforcement quietly monitored the board, because sometimes, days after a particularly elaborate post, a murder would occur in the same city mentioned online. One user, going by the name Patient 9, posted repeatedly in a style eerily similar to Clarence's documented handwriting. His messages always ended the same: "Are you awake?" The FBI investigated but could not locate the server. The Hive dissolved in 2004, vanishing overnight, leaving only broken links and scattered screenshots. The 9/11 silence. Curiously, in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, Clarence Hill's name disappeared from headlines altogether. America's attention turned outward to terrorism, wars abroad, new kinds of dread. For a time, the legend of Clarence felt provincial, almost outdated. Some said this was why he paused again, because the nation's gaze had shifted and the impact of his terror would be diminished. But families of victims whispered another theory, that Clarence was watching, waiting until the panic subsided, until the wound of that tragedy scarred over. Only then would he reemerge. The return of the grin. In 2006, in Milwaukee, a young couple was found in their apartment. Both were posed upright at the dining table, hands clasped, heads tilted toward each other. Their mouths had been carved into hideous smiles. On the table was a single printed sheet of paper. "History is a banquet. You have forgotten your guest." The handwriting was unmistakable. The phrase echoed his earliest letters from the 1970s. Within days, Clarence Hill was back in the news cycle. Cable anchors, now equipped with rolling graphics and digital sound effects, plastered his name across screens. "Smile killer strikes again." Law enforcement admitted nothing. But inside private memos, analysts compared the new murder with Clarence's earliest confirmed acts. The precision, the patience, the ritual, everything aligned. The file was reopened. The smile was awake again. The online haunting. By the late 2000s, Clarence Hill's myth no longer required print to spread. He flourished online. YouTube hosted grainy documentaries narrated in whispers with titles like The Hive Remains and Smiling Man, The Untold Files. Urban legend forums debated whether Clarence was immortal, a demon who possessed different bodies across generations. Some even linked him to historical cases predating his birth, a curse that wore new faces over centuries. Worse still were the videos claiming to show him, shaky cell phone footage of a tall man smiling too broadly at a bus station, a stranger walking past a playground, his grin unnatural, his eyes fixed on children. None were verified, but the comments sections became ritualistic. "He's awake. The hive grows. Do not smile back." Children who had never read a newspaper clipping now whispered Clarence's name at sleepovers. The legend had survived the transition into a new century, stronger than before. The hospitals again in 2008. 3 disappearances rattled Detroit's medical community. 2 nurses and a night shift orderly from different hospitals vanished without trace. Their lockers were untouched, their cars still in the lots. In each hospital, staff discovered strange items left behind, old surgical instruments rusted beyond use, a cracked ether mask, a bloodied set of calipers. A bone saw with initials filed off. The instruments were wrapped in linen marked property of St. Jude's. It was a calculated cruelty scent. Jude's had been demolished years earlier, yet Clarence still carried its artifacts, preserving its memory like holy relics. A retired physician wrote an anonymous editorial in the Detroit Free Press. "These are not murders. They are resurrections. Hill is not killing people. He is resurrecting the institution that birthed him. He carries St. Jude's within him, a traveling ward without walls." The editorial was swiftly pulled, but the damage was done. The failed trap in 2009, the FBI attempted something bold. An agent posed online as a follower of Clarence, leaking a fabricated story about a hidden ward beneath an abandoned factory outside Cleveland. Days later, surveillance cameras caught a man entering the site, tall, thin, with a slow, deliberate gait. He smiled directly into the lens before it fizzled into static. When agents stormed the building, they found nothing but a single item left behind, a children's primer, its cover drawn over with a black marker smile. The footage was reviewed, enhanced, slowed frame by frame. The grin, though blurred, seemed unmistakable, but forensic experts disagreed. It might have been Clarence, or it might have been a trick, a follower acting out his ghost. The FBI called it inconclusive. But internally, the file noted, subject remains aware of surveillance tactics. Subject is watching us as much as we are watching him. The 2010 whisper in the last week of 2010, a final letter arrived at the offices of the Detroit Free Press. It was handwritten in careful script. The lights grow brighter, the hives are still, but I do not sleep, neither should you. It was signed simply, C.H. No further proof was offered. No murder followed immediately after. But to those who remembered the 1970s, the letter was enough. Clarence Hill had endured again. A smile that survives technology by the close of the first decade of the 21st century. Clarence Hill had accomplished the impossible. He had adapted. In an age of cameras, satellites, DNA databases, and digital fingerprints, he had not been caught. More disturbingly, he had not even been diminished. He had transcended the body. He was now a virus carried through rumor, through glowing screens, through the image of a smile that appeared when one least expected it, and his question, whispered in every forum, every schoolyard, every shadowed street, remained the same: are you awake? The Hive Online, the second decade of the 21st century, should have been Clarence Hill's undoing. Every face was captured now, every movement logged, every click traced. Cities had become panopticons, phones were leashes, even idle whispers could be recorded. But Clarence had always thrived in institutions. St. Jude's was his first hive, the prisons, the hospitals, the archives, all cages of order, all brittle. The internet was simply another ward, another hive. And Clarence moved through it with the same spectral grace. The Creepypasta years by 2012, Clarence's name had escaped the newspapers and court files. He had been reborn in online folklore. Creepypasta forums retold his history in fractured, haunted fragments. Some posts lifted directly from trial transcripts and psychiatric notes, others blended truth with invention. A popular story, shared thousands of times, claimed that Clarence's letters were not written in ink at all, but in diluted embalming fluid. Another insisted his grin was not carved by knives but stretched, that he had taught himself to dislocate his jaw. Teenagers began sharing images labeled the Hill Smile Challenge, grainy photos of themselves with mouths pulled back into grotesque grins. The captions always read, "Are you awake?" It was entertainment, mostly, harmless play, but police noted a chilling pattern. Wherever the meme spread most feverishly, reports of disappearances soon followed. The Lansing house in 2013, a landlord in Lansing entered one of his rental properties after months of silence from the tenant. Inside, the walls were covered in photographs, grainy black and white clippings of Clarence's earliest crimes. Newspaper articles, mugshots, even family photographs of the Hills carefully reprinted and arranged. On the kitchen table sat a single chair. Its seat was stained. Above it, pinned neatly to the wall, was a surgical mask painted with a crude smile. The tenant was gone. When police released photographs of the house, online forums immediately proclaimed it a Clarence shrine. Some argued it was evidence of the real man still living. Others insisted it was the work of a disciple. Either way, the symbolism was undeniable. Clarence's hive had found a digital body. The video in October of 2014, a video surfaced on YouTube titled "Patient Still Awake." It lasted exactly 2 minutes. The footage, seemingly recorded on VHS, showed a dim hospital ward, empty beds, rusted Roman IV stands. A camera panned shakily through the room before settling on a figure in the corner. A man stood there, tall and gaunt. His head tilted, his mouth fixed in a rictus smile. The grain blurred his features, but the effect was unmistakable. After 30 seconds of silence, the man raised his hand and pointed directly at the camera. The tape cut to black. It was uploaded from an untraceable account. Within hours, the video spread across horror forums and Twitter, earning millions of views before YouTube removed it for graphic content. But screenshots endured. The smile endured. Some viewers swore the man's eyes followed them across the screen. Others claimed the smile flickered, stretching wider each time they replayed it. The FBI never confirmed its authenticity. But privately, a note in the Hill file read, "Post, processed, however, subject may have staged." The conference in 2015, a group of scholars gathered at a criminology conference in Chicago. Their panel was titled, "Clarence Hill and the Persistence of Folklore in the Digital Age." They argued Clarence was no longer alive. that what the world witnessed was nothing more than narrative contagion, a story adapted for the internet age, retold by desperate imitators. But when the lead presenter opened his folder to read from the archives, he found a letter that had not been there before. Neatly folded in precise handwriting, "Do not speak of contagion, speak of hives, and remember I hear you." Security was called. The room was evacuated. The scholars refused to discuss it afterward. The vanishing students by 2016, Clarence Hill had become a challenge among students. Some held Clarence Nights parties where guests told his story by candlelight, daring one another to carve smiles into apples, to whisper "Are you awake?" into mirrors. That year, 4 students from Ann Arbor vanished after one such gathering. Police found their rented house in disarray, candles melted down to nubs, ash scattered across the floor and on the wall in soot. The hive accepts. The students were never recovered. Their laptops contained saved images of Clarence Hill clippings sent. Jude's Asylum floor plans and a folder titled Resurrections. Its files were corrupted. The digital hive the late 2010s saw Clarence evolve once more. Twitter accounts appeared, posting cryptic phrases in block text. The hive does not sleep. Instagram profiles uploaded blurred images of hospitals and smiling mannequins. Entire Reddit threads dissected every murder in Michigan, looking for signs of his hand. The FBI admitted that distinguishing between genuine crimes and Clarence-inspired hoaxes was impossible. The myth had become self-sustaining, yet there were still anomalies. A nurse in Grand Rapids strangled with surgical tubing, a drifter in Toledo found with a carved grin, a Detroit man discovered in a parking garage, posed upright as though sitting for a portrait, eyes taped open. Each death carried Clarence's signature precision. Each death echoed his old themes: hospitals, restraint, performance. If it was not Clarence himself, it was someone who had studied him with religious devotion. The 2019 letter in December 2019, an envelope arrived at the offices of the New Yorker. It contained a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The letter read, "You tell stories, but remember, stories are hives too. They carry more than words, they carry teeth." The photograph was of the magazine's staff cafeteria, smiling faces, except one face in the background, a tall, thin man, mouth stretched wide, blurred but unmistakable. The editors dismissed it as a hoax, but the FBI quietly filed it, because the cafeteria had no record of visitors that day. Pandemic silence. When the pandemic struck in 2020, Clarence's trail went eerily silent. The streets were empty, the hospitals overwhelmed, the hives swollen with fear and disease. Some said it was the perfect stage for him. Others said the silence itself was the performance. Police records show at least 5 nurses vanished in Michigan that year, but with chaos at its height, no one looked closely. Perhaps that was Clarence's design, to kill while the world counted other numbers. A legend with Wi-Fi by the decades close, Clarence Hill had become something new. Not only a man, not only a myth, but an algorithm. His smile lived in memes, in shared screenshots, in archived videos that resurfaced no matter how many times they were deleted. Every generation retold him in its own language. The 1970s had typewritten letters. The 1980s had cult gatherings. The 1990s had TV dramatizations. The 2000s had forums, and now the 2010s had hashtags. But beneath each translation, the same grin lingered, the same hive stirred, and still, the same question pulsed through every screen: "Are you awake?" The smiling algorithm. By 2021, the internet no longer merely told Clarence Hill's story, it wore his face. Artificial intelligence had grown sophisticated enough to invent anything: a voice from one clip, a smile from another, shadows stitched into something new. And yet, amid the flood of synthetic horrors, Clarence felt different. He was not only replicated, he was reappearing. The live stream on the night of March 3, 2021, a Twitch streamer named J Horror broadcasted from his apartment in Cleveland. His channel specialized in reading true crime cases to a live audience, and that night he had chosen Clarence Hill. Detroit's smiling ghost, Jay called him, leaning into the webcam. Thousands of viewers tuned in as Jay read from court transcripts and news clippings. The chat flooded with laughing emojis, people mocking the myth as boomer creepypasta. And then, at the 40-minute mark, Jay froze. His eyes darted off-screen. "Hold on," he whispered. "Someone's at the window." Viewers laughed. "Good bit, bro," scripted jump scare, but Jay wasn't smiling. He turned his camera toward the window, and for a brief second, the stream caught a reflection. A tall man in a dark coat, grinning too wide. The stream cut out. Jay never returned. His apartment was found locked from the inside. His chair overturned. On his desk, the words, "Are you awake?" had been scratched into the wood. The clip spread across TikTok and Twitter within hours, clipped and memed 1,000 times over. Authorities dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, but Jay's body was never recovered. The deepfake wars. As deepfake technology matured, Clarence became an icon for the uncanny valley. Dozens of AI-generated clips began circulating. Clarence smiling in a grocery aisle, Clarence boarding a bus, Clarence standing in a hospital corridor. Skeptics dismissed them all. Too clean, too polished, too obviously fabricated. But some clips were harder to explain. One video showed him walking through an abandoned Detroit school, the windows boarded, the halls filled with dust. But when investigators checked metadata, the building had already been demolished years before the footage was uploaded. "How do you deepfake a place that doesn't exist anymore?" one detective asked. No one answered. The TikTok challenge. In late 2022, teenagers invented a viral trend, the Clarence Smile Challenge. The rules were simple. Film yourself walking down a hallway at night, then turn suddenly to grin at the camera while whispering, "Are you awake?" For most, it was a joke, but police across Michigan noted a disturbing pattern. Several teens who participated never uploaded a second video. Their phones were found abandoned, their accounts wiped clean. Parents begged TikTok to ban the trend. TikTok complied, but the videos always came back, uploaded from new accounts, often paired with audio that no one could trace. A faint humming, like an old lullaby, the same hymn Clarence's mother once sang. The Ann Arbor Hospital incident in March 2023. Ann Arbor police responded to a call from an abandoned psychiatric wing slated for demolition. Teenagers had broken in to film a Clarence hunt live stream. The feed began with laughter, flashlights cutting through moldy corridors. Viewers typed frenzied comments, "Where's the ghost? Show us Clarence." Then the camera captured something in the hallway, a man tall, dressed in black, his grin impossibly wide. The screams that followed lasted less than a minute before the feed cut. When police arrived, the cameras lay smashed. The teens were gone. On the wall, written in what appeared to be ash, the hive feeds. The footage was never released officially, but enough viewers had already clipped fragments to circulate online. Millions watched. And in every repost, the comments repeated the same phrase, "That smile wasn't CGI." The algorithm that wouldn't forget. By 2024, Clarence Hill was everywhere, not through his own hand, but through the algorithm itself. YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, their recommendation systems fed him like oxygen. Search for true crime, Clarence appeared. Search for urban legends, Clarence appeared. Even searches unrelated, gardening tutorials, cooking tips, were occasionally interrupted by distorted videos, faces smiling too wide, captions whispering, "Are you awake?" A Reddit user documented the phenomenon in a long thread titled, "The Hill Glitch." He argued that Clarence's name and imagery had become a data parasite, embedded so deeply into the web's infrastructure that it couldn't be deleted. "Clarence isn't a man anymore," the user wrote. "He's code." That thread ended abruptly when the user deleted his account. Hours later, someone posted his doxed information alongside a blurry photograph, a tall figure standing across the street from his apartment. The return to Detroit in late 2024. Rumors emerged of a series of killings in Detroit's Cass Corridor. Victims were found posed in grotesque tableau. A nurse seated upright with her eyes taped open. A drifter arranged in bed like a child awaiting a lullaby. A pastor forced into a pew with a hymn book clutched in his hands. Each scene echoed Clarence's history. Each scene whispered familiarity, but the details were sharper than any copycats, the cuts precise, the staging deliberate. For the first time in decades, investigators admitted off record, it feels like him. The broadcast on New Year's Eve 2025, a pirated signal hijacked dozens of local TV stations across Michigan. Viewers expecting fireworks saw only static. Then, slowly, a face emerged from the grain, Clarence Hill. He did not speak, he only smiled. The broadcast lasted 3 minutes before cutting back to normal programming, but in that silence, thousands of homes had seen him. Thousands had carried his image into midnight, into the new year. Some swore that as the screen faded, he mouthed words without sound, still awake. The hive awakens by the end of 2025. Clarence Hill was no longer merely a fugitive, nor even a myth. He was both virus and ghost, spreading through code and rumor, appearing in alleys and on screens impossible to contain. Parents warned their children the same way grandparents once had. If a man smiles too wide, don't follow him. But now, the warning extended beyond streets and doorways. Now it meant, don't click that link, don't watch that video, don't share that smile, because Clarence's hive had evolved, no longer confined to a single city or even to flesh. It lived in every reflection, every feed, every late-night search, and always the question returned, whispered through wires and screens, through alleys and hospitals. Are you awake? The hive eternal welcome back. What began in the wards of St. Jude, in the cramped records of Detroit's hospitals, now ends in the labyrinth of the present. Yet end is the wrong word. Legends do not end, they ferment, they seep. They awaken where silence grows heavy. Clarence Hill's story does not close, it multiplies. Tonight, we step into the final ledger of his legacy, one written not in ink or blood alone, but in the breathless hush of those who still whisper his name. The case that refuses closure. By 2026, the FBI listed Clarence Hill's file as archival threat, active cultural influence. It was the only case to bear that label. He was not treated as a fugitive anymore, nor as a closed file. Instead, the Bureau admitted what the public had known for decades. Clarence Hill was two beings at once. One, a man of flesh, who once cut and smiled, who left bodies in hospitals, homes, highways. Two, a shadow carried through rumor, cult, and code, impossible to erase. Even if Clarence Hill is long dead, one agent remarked under redaction, the hive lives on, and the hive does not require a body. The digital exorcism. In early 2026, Silicon Valley engineers attempted an unprecedented purge. AI firms coordinated with federal agencies to scrub Clarence from digital archives. His name was filtered, his face blurred, his letters flagged as harmful misinformation. For a week, the web grew quiet. No Clarence Smile Challenge, no TikTok clips, no blurred CCTV faces in Detroit forums, but the silence broke. Within days, anonymous uploads appeared on encrypted servers. Videos showed Clarence's grin imposed onto politicians' faces, children's cartoons, weather forecasts. Each clip carried the same caption, "You cannot excise a hive." The attempt to erase him only fed him. What was suppression became proof. People whispered that Clarence himself had returned to defend his name, his hive. Others insisted it was the cults, the scattered awakened, still feeding the myth. But whether man or follower, his presence spread sharper than before. The return to the house in July of that same year, a demolition crew entered the derelict Hill family home in Detroit. The property had been condemned for decades, its walls sagging, its porch collapsing into weeds. But inside, the crew found the impossible, the furniture untouched by dust, a table laid for supper, a child's toys scattered on the bedroom floor, wet with crimson, though no source of blood was found. In the kitchen, a hymn book lay open to the page Clarence's mother had once sung. On the wall, carved deep as if by bone saw, "Still home." Police sealed the site. Photographs leaked nonetheless. They circulated online with one unshakable note. There were no footprints in the dust, no evidence of intrusion. Only the house itself, reset to the night Clarence vanished. The scholars warning historians of folklore now treat Clarence Hill as more than a criminal case. They speak of him in the same breath as Spring, Healed Jack, the Black-Eyed Children, or Bloody Mary. Yet Clarence differs from all of them in one way. His origin is provable, rooted in names, wards, transcripts, and bloodied reports. At a 2027 symposium at Yale, a professor concluded, "Most legends are born of shadows and built into myth. Clarence Hill was born of fact, then swallowed by shadow. He is unique in that both histories are true." The room sat in silence. Because if both are true, then Clarence Hill can never be unmade. The last recording on New Year's Eve, 2028. A security camera in downtown Detroit recorded something authorities have never released in full. Only fragments reached the public: a tall man walking through snow, a black coat, a wide grin. The figure approached the lens closer and closer until his mouth filled the frame, his lips moved. Though the audio was corrupted, analysts reconstructed 3 words with chilling clarity: "I am awake." The tape ends there. The guard on shift that night was never seen again. His chair was discovered overturned, his radio still buzzing faint static. The hive without flesh, so we return to the question that has haunted every investigator, every scholar, every witness. Was Clarence Hill ever truly caught? No record exists of his death. No confession was ever written. And yet no proof survives that he walks among us now. But does it matter? The hive no longer requires Clarence's body. He has multiplied in every whisper, every dare, every child's rhyme. He is told in playgrounds as folklore, in college dorms as caution, in urban alleys as ghost story. His image bleeds through code. His name infects algorithms. His smile grafts itself onto strangers at bus stops and reflections in glass. The hive feeds. The hive endures. Closing the ledger, Clarence Hill's tale began in a hospital ward where doctors called him patient. It wound through courtrooms, alleys, homes, and cults. It spilled into screens, into mirrors, into digital feeds. Each generation tried to bury him. Each failure made him stronger. And now, as archivists, we are left with this dilemma. When does a killer stop being a man and become a myth? When does the myth stop being story and become reality again? The ledger offers no final answer, only this: on nights when silence grows heavy, when static flickers on screens, when a smile lasts too long in a stranger's face, listen closely. For you may hear his question carried from wards to wires, from history to present: "Are you awake?"